Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we think of May 1945, we usually picture the cheering crowds, the white flags, and this clean, decisive end to the horrors of the Second World War. But history rarely gives us a clean break, does it? The reality is that the surrender of Nazi Germany wasn't the final scene of a movie. It was actually the opening act of a messy, incredibly complicated, decades-long cleanup. The Allies weren't just left standing in ruined cities. They had to figure out what on earth to do with highly advanced war machines, hundreds of thousands of ideologically driven men, and even the very bloodlines of the Third Reich's most notorious architects.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to take a really fascinating macro to micro journey today. We'll be looking at 1. The fall and surrender. 2. Sinking the war machine. 3. Rehabilitating the Waffen-SS. 4. The loyal descendants. And finally, 5. Breaking the bloodline.
Let's start right off with Section 1, the fall and surrender. We need to look at the immediate sheer chaos right after the regime collapsed.
The jump from the battlefield to the courtroom was remarkably fast. Right after the unconditional surrender in May 45, the Allies were scrambling. They had to secure weapons, sure, but also high-ranking officials and their families. By November, the monumental Nuremberg trials had already opened, setting up the whole legal framework for this massive cleanup. Fast forward to October 1946, and the entire SS is declared a criminal organization. But this legal reckoning swept up families too. By March 1948, Emmy Goering, who was basically the highly visible First Lady of the Reich, was classified as a major offender by a denazification tribunal. They permanently stripped her of her property, her wealth, her status, the whole shebang.
Moving from the legal machinery, we turn to the physical hardware. In Section 2, sinking the war machine.
116. I really want you to remember that number. When the war ended, over 150 German U-boats surrendered. Now, keeping them afloat was insanely costly, and storing them, basically impossible. So the Royal Navy kicked off Operation Deadlight. Out of the total surrendered, 116 U-boats were designated for total destruction. During the absolutely bitter winter of 1945 to 1946, these massive submarines were dragged out into the rough, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic just to be deliberately sunk by naval gunfire and explosive charges.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the geopolitical tightrope the Allies were walking at the dawn of the Cold War. There was a stark contrast in how they handled this fleet. The older, battered U-boats, indiscriminately destroyed, sent straight to the bottom of the ocean. However, the Allies were absolutely eager to preserve the state-of-the-art Type 21 and 23 submarines. The US, the UK, and the Soviet Union practically carved up these newer vessels amongst themselves. Why? Well, they wanted to reverse-engineer their revolutionary snorkel systems and streamlined hydrodynamics. This was the exact technology that would directly kickstart the Cold War's submarine arms race.
Let's move to and see how this builds as we enter Section 3, rehabilitating the Waffen-SS. We're shifting from the disposal of steel and iron to the immensely complicated problem of human personnel.
So you have hundreds of thousands of Waffen-SS veterans who were captured. By 1946, as we established, they legally belonged to a criminal organization. But by 1951, former high-ranking officers got together and formed a group known as HIAC. It started off as a mutual aid association, but man, it rapidly evolved into a powerful lobbying machine. Their ultimate goal? To secure state pensions for veterans, and, more audaciously, to literally rewrite history. They financed memoirs and pushed a heavy revisionist narrative claiming the Waffen-SS was just an apolitical fighting force. Just normal soldiers doing their duty.
What's really interesting about this is how insanely effective that lobbying actually was. By 1953, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer publicly stated that Waffen-SS men had fought as soldiers just like others. Cold War pragmatism and the undeniable political need for the votes of millions of returning veterans and their families led the highest levels of government to publicly normalize these men. It was a very calculated shift away from strict denazification, leaning heavily toward political and economic stability instead.
But reintegrating them was a really complex reality. The 1950 War Victims Relief Act opened the door for fierce debates over pensions for these ex-SS members. Now, while some attempted to join the new West German Army, the Bundeswehr, only 508 out of over 3,000 early applicants were actually accepted. The vast majority of them quietly blended into civilian jobs in factories and construction. They were looking forward, not backward. But the moral cost of this economic reintegration was staggering. Decades later, journalists uncovered a really painful truth. Many former SS men were comfortably receiving state pensions, while some Holocaust survivors still had not received comparable compensation.
Economic recovery had clearly outpaced moral reckoning, which is a pretty powerful reminder of how easily societies can prioritize moving forward over looking back at uncomfortable truths.
We're going to zoom into the micro level now, in Section 4, the loyal descendants. Let's look at the intimate, psychological aftermath for the children of the Third Reich's most notorious architects.
The descendants of these Nazi leaders essentially split into two very distinct camps when reacting to their inherited history. On one side, we've got the defenders of the legacy, figures like Gudrun Himmler, Wolf Hess, and Etta Goering. They zealously protected their father's memories. But on the flip side, we have the confronters of the legacy, people like Nicholas Frank, Albert Speer Jr., and Rolf Mengele. They radically rejected their fathers and carried the incredibly heavy burden of those crimes.
Let's look at a defender for a second. Etta Goering's life was a dramatic fall from grace. I mean, she was Hitler's goddaughter, treated like the Reich's little princess. She grew up on the lavish Karinhall estate, literally with her own miniature palace built right there in the orchard. But in 1945, that childhood abruptly ended in an Allied internment building. She spent her adult life working quietly as a medical technical assistant. Yet despite the absolutely undeniable historical record of her father Hermann Goering's crimes, she never disowned him. She insisted to her final days that she only remembered a kind and loving father.
Wolf Hess, the son of the Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, took this defense even further. He didn't just hold on to fond memories, he took organized, active steps. He visited his father frequently in Spandau prison. He even established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, amassing hundreds of thousands of supporters. He authored books advocating that his father was a German hero, not a criminal. This fiercely loyal, active defense, it perfectly mirrored the institutional lobbying tactics we saw earlier with the HIAG Veterans Group.
But what about the folks on the other side of the table? We pivot now to Section 5, Breaking the Bloodline, exploring the lives of those who chose to confront the horrors directly.
Nicholas Frank is basically the antithesis of Etta Goering and Wolf Hess. As the son of Hans Frank, the notorious butcher of Poland, Nicholas spent his entire adult life deeply grappling with the monstrous acts committed by his father. Instead of defending him, Nicholas chose to publicly and relentlessly denounce him. He did this most notably through his book, In the Shadow of the Reich. He committed his life to educating the public about the Holocaust, choosing to break that cycle of denial by facing his inherited shame totally head-on.
So the crucial point is exactly how far some of these descendants were willing to go to stop this history from passing on. Bettina Goering, the grandniece of Hermann Goering, grew up fully aware of the massive international weight her last name carried. She eventually moved to the United States to distance herself, but that psychological burden, it just remained. In a profoundly chilling and permanent decision, Bettina revealed that she and her brother voluntarily underwent sterilization. It was a deliberate, conscious choice to end the line and ensure that no future generation would ever have to inherit the dark shadow of the Goering bloodline.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and to this really provocative question. Think about it. From the physical silencing of 116 U-boats at the bottom of the Atlantic, to the bureaucratic normalization of SS veterans, all the way to the literal, metaphorical silencing of a notorious bloodline through sterilization, can a dark historical legacy ever be truly erased, or does it simply change forms? It's definitely something to chew on the next time we look at the messy aftermath of major historical events. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. See you next time.